Well, hello again, and we are continuing in our series, which is about Trinity Church and that we develop people who are then able to join in God's work in the wider world. And so today might be called our Veterans Day version because we have one of our newer members of our church, Andy Murray. Good morning, Andy. How are you doing?
Good morning, Father. Very well. Thanks for this opportunity on Veterans Weekend. I appreciate it.
So you and I have stories. We like to tell stories, and you have some great stories, both really particularly about vocation and call and serving the Lord. So, but your story almost takes like a twist that we wouldn't expect. So, when did you first sense, God in your life was calling you to more than just going to church on Sundays?
Father, I was actually in Connecticut at the time, and I was going to school at Kent School in Kent, Connecticut. And at that time, I was participating in the Episcopal Church there as a sacristan in that parish on the campus. And I began to feel as though I had a calling to the priesthood. And so shortly after graduating from Kent, I actually entered into the seminary to discern a vocation to the priesthood.
Wow. So that's really amazing. An Episcopal, you know, who thought that anything good could come out of an Episcopal high school? Maybe we should ask M. Night Shyamalan, who also went to a Episcopal high school in Philadelphia. But
Ah,
regardless,
interesting.
regardless of that, so you started off into seminary, but that's not where the vocation that God called you to.
No, it certainly isn't. And so I had been in the seminary for a couple of semesters, and I decided I wasn't quite ready at that point in time, and that I might return at some later date when I felt a little bit more prepared to do so. So I had moved on to another school. And shortly after I got to that next school, I ran into a Marine officer recruiter. I had never, ever once in my life thought about the possibility of being a Marine or a Marine officer in that particular case. And I asked him what he was doing there on campus. He told me. And by the end of that day, he had recruited me, and I would soon be headed that summer down to Quantico, Virginia for officer candidates school.
Wow, that's something. But there was a little twist that happened as you were considering that as a vocation. So tell us that little bit about that story.
Yeah, Father, I was just a couple of months away from graduation, and I was taking a summer course, the last of the credit hours that I needed, and I had developed a close friendship with one of my fellow students in this class that I was taking, and she had gotten to know me. She had gotten to know me as a person of faith. She was a person of faith, and one day when we got talking about what my plans for the future were, um, she asked me, how could a person of faith like myself consider joining an organization like the United States Marine Corps? And I was very taken aback by that question. But I realized immediately that she had a different perspective of what that sort of life might mean. And so I thought about it a little bit. I hadn't really considered it much. And I told her that it was my intent to live my Christian vocation through my life as a Marine officer. And at that point in time, I figured I would probably spend 4 years in the Marine Corps and then go back home to upstate New York and be a coach and a teacher the way my father had been.
Hmm.
Um, but I ended up living that vocation as a Marine officer for over 30 years. And it was the most incredible experience. And looking back on it, I can't imagine having done anything else with my early adult life.
So that's what a fact. Like, who would have imagined that God would have really intervened right before you take off for Quantico and to really kind of remind you that your first call is to serve God as a Christian. That's your vocation. And it's going to take place through this other job, this other work
Sure.
as a Marine. So, in your 30 years, I mean, so were you ever deployed as a Marine?
Yeah, in fact, at my first duty station, which was out at Camp Pendleton, which is in California, about 30 minutes north of San Diego, I hadn't been there very long, and we actually went out to did a relatively brief several week deployment out on board some naval amphibious shipping out of San Diego. Actually deployed on an LHA, which is the amphibious equivalent of an aircraft carrier, but for Marines, for helicopters and jets, so on. So just happened that when I was out on board that ship for the time that I was out there, was looking forward to the opportunity to go to daily mass, and we had a number of folks on the ship with me, Marines and Navy personnel that hoped to be able to do that while we were out there. And what we found was there was not a chaplain assigned to the ship during the time that we were going to be deployed. And everything that was necessary was available. And I was told that if I had the capacity to lead communion services, that there was a stock of blessed Eucharist and that I could, in fact, lead communion services. So I did that every day for the 2 or so weeks that we were deployed out on board ship, and that was a very unique
Wow,
experience for me, one that I
that's a great
wouldn't have
story.
expected.
You also told another story of a time when, as you were making the transition or applying to move from reserve officer to full-time active duty officer, that you had another kind of odd encounter that you wouldn't have expected, but that God put you in a certain place at a certain time.
Yeah, it was a wholly unique experience. And I had been in Kuwait for several months at this point. It was in preparation for what would become Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And as you mentioned, I had applied for a regular commission. So I was transitioning from a reserve commission to a regular commission. And there was an interview process in order to do this. Well, I had been felled by a bout with encephalitis. I spent several weeks in the Fleet Hospital there in Kuwait, and I lost the ability to speak, and thankfully recovered. But on the day that I recovered and I was released from the hospital, I was told that I would have my interview that evening with Major General Hopkins. Major General Hopkins was the commander of the Tactical Marine Forces in what would become the Desert Shield, Desert Storm um, engagement, if you will. So I went and sat for several hours because he had several meetings that afternoon and evening. And when he finally got done, he came out. He looked so tired. I figured the last thing he wanted was to sit down with some young lieutenant and do an interview for his augmentation to a regular commission. But he called me in. We went in. We went into his living spaces, and I sat down across from him, and he asked me to tell him a little bit about myself. And he asked me if I was, if I was a man of faith, if I was a churchgoer. And I told him my experience. I told him that I had thought that I might have a calling to the priesthood, but decided after some consideration to join the Marine Corps instead. And there was some sort of connection between us that opened his heart, opened my heart, and it was a chance encounter in the desert. His wife had passed away several months earlier, and he was having difficulty dealing with that while dealing with the challenges that he had in his command position. And I think what he was looking for was just simply an ear to listen to. So
Hmm.
he never interviewed me, and he just talked, unburdened himself of some things that were creating some difficulty for him, creating some friction. And that was all that my interview consisted of.
Hmm.
And he, based on that, he gave me a very good evaluation
Hmm.
and recommended me for that regular commission. But it was one of the most amazing faith experiences that I had in my time in the Marine Corps. He really touched me, and I think some degree we were both touched by the Holy Spirit that evening.
Hmm. So how fascinating that you, from the time you're already a Christian, you have a sense of call, vocation to serve Christ in the world. And then all those years passed, and here you are in Kuwait on the edge of Desert Storm, and God has you in this office on this day to talk to this person so that he'd be able to talk about what was going on for him. I mean, that's just the way the Holy Spirit works. Well, let's segue to today. So now you've got this whole new life. You've retired, and you and Pam are living here in, is it Granby or North Granby?
Granby, Father.
Granby. And so you're doing there. So what would you say, your primary vocation, your call is right now today?
So I've gone from living my vocation as a Marine officer to living my vocation as husband to Pam and a father to our combined Brady Bunch family of 9 children. We only have 3 of them at home at this point, so Pam and I are actively raising 3 teenagers, 2 18-year-olds and a 15-year-old, 2 boys and a girl. Um, but my vocation is my love and marriage, Pam, and the responsibility for loving and raising 3 young children. A
Yeah, it's
noble,
interesting that
noble experience.
we often think of vocation as I'm being sent away to some foreign place or to the exception of holy orders. And yet the most basic and powerful ways that God calls us to serve him is simply to love and to love our husbands or wives, and in the way we try to love and raise our children, to do our best in that, as that's a vocation. And that influence, is what really builds people. So Andy, thanks so much for your time this morning. So that's really what this series is about, is that we don't give simply to keep the doors open here at Trinity Church. We give toward a generous God in order that we might develop a community where people can be formed as disciples of Jesus wherever they are, at home, with kids, taking care of aging parents, serving God on the precipice of a battle in Kuwait. So it's an amazing thing, but that's what we do here at Trinity. And that's what we want to give toward when it comes up for our celebration Sunday. So thanks again, Andy, and we'll talk to you soon.
If I may, Father, if I could just take a moment to all the veterans of Trinity and all the veterans of Terrafil, and just an opportunity to say thank you very much for your service.